July the 2nd, 2015, the hottest day of the year. In the Inigo rooms in London's Somerset House, the heat is overpowering. The hubbub of conversation fills the air as guests celebrate 100 years of the Ben-Uri Art Gallery. They aren't aware that a drama is about to unfold, centred around one of the paintings in this world-class collection of émigré and Jewish art. The gallery has owned the painting, which is a jewel in Ben-Uri's lavish crown and worth more than £1 million since it was painted in 1920. But there is something that even Ben-Uri does not know about it. Until this evening, when a distinguished art professor spots something that no one has ever seen before. She thinks there is something beneath the painting, possibly another picture, and the only way to solve this mystery is to scan and x-ray the canvas once the exhibition is over. It is incredible, but no more incredible than the story of the artist who painted the picture, David Bomberg.
It's a very complex story, very complex indeed, and very moving too in many ways. This young man who came from very, very nowhere land and ended up being one of the major British artists of the 20th century.
I don't think when I was very little people thought of him as a great artist. Sometimes we would be sent pictures of him at some exhibition, but I don't think I was aware he was a famous artist. I just knew he was something called an artist. That's what I thought of him. No, I didn't think of him I didn't know he was a great artist.
I think I first came across Bomberg's work when there was a revelatory exhibition in London in the 1960s of his early paintings and drawings of watercolours, none of which had been seen for decades. They'd all been hidden away in storage because the young Bomberg hadn't been able to sell them, which is an extraordinary thought in itself. And they were rediscovered really by his widow Lillian and put on view in the West End of London, and it was a complete revelation. Because nobody really knew anything about. They'd heard of him, of course, but he'd been lost sight of.
David Bomberg was an artist who refused to conform. His horror at his brother's death in service in the First World War was so great that he shot himself, not in an act of cowardice, but in desperation. At the end of the war, he returned home, an unhappy and troubled soul. And as a Jewish artist, his life was often difficult.
I think Jewish artists in Britain during the early 20th century did actually suffer from racism. There's no doubt about that at all. You can see it in Epstein's career, for example, as well.
It's certainly striking when you read reports of the immigrant community from about 1880 to about 1915, how the language, the rhetoric, the prejudices, the stereotypes mirror in many cases what we read today about more recent migrants and refugees.
I mean, I think that, yes, a migrant can bring a whole new insight. What they bring in terms of a wider vision is very often negated by the difficulties that they encounter, the economic difficulties above all.
What people read into the community from outside is very different from what's actually happening within it, the sort of attitudes that people have within it. Again, very much like today, I think people misread and sort of map their own prejudices onto immigrant and migrant communities.
Bomberg felt a great affinity to the community in which he lived. He cared about its people and its institutions.
He brought the children out. He took them to the theatres, he took them around the East End. And he took them to the famous Ghetto Theatre. He took them to the Yiddish theatre, and they were delighted with that. They saw Shakespeare in Yiddish, and the atmosphere was terrific, for them.
The Yiddish theatre was more than just a theatre. It was central to the life of Jewish people in London's East End, somewhere for people to meet, to forget about their worries, and to lose themselves in a make-believe world. Bomberg enjoyed painting scenes from the theatre. But it was the audiences, not the performances, that fascinated him. And they inspired one of his greatest paintings, the Ghetto Theatre, the subject of our mystery.
The Ghetto Theatre painting is very different. The figures are still there watching the play, but they seem somehow very withdrawn. It's more to do with people who seem to be lost in their own worlds. And I think it's very much painting about the aftermath of the First World War. The audience seems to be almost imprisoned within this structure that Bomberg creates around them. They seem to be almost trapped, if that's not too strong a word, and unable somehow to be liberated by the experience of the play that they are watching.
So Bomberg's Ghetto Theatre is pretty much 99.9% certain we can say the Pavilion Theatre Mile End. A very big institution in the East End throughout the 19th century, had a very big Victorian history, had elaborate stage machinery, some of the best of any theatre in London, known for its pantomimes, its melodramas, and it lasted until the 30s, until the Second World War. It suffered bomb damage and was pulled down. But from about 1905-6, it's used regularly for performances of Yiddish theatre, and it was very well known as such by the time Bomberg would have discovered it. And it was also something that a lot of English writers and journalists and intellectuals were curious about and went along to.
Well, it's always intriguing to hear about paintings underneath pictures, because very often they turn out to be earlier works that the artist himself or herself has done, and for one reason or another, whether it's dissatisfaction with the previous work or whether it's actually lack of money which drives them, alas really, to overpaint something that shouldn't have really ideally have been overpainted. We don't really know, but it does happen.
6 months have now passed. It is winter and the gallery is silent. The exhibition is over. The Ghetto Theatre can now be taken down from the wall. The next step is solving the mystery of what lies beneath the canvas. But first, Ben-Uri curator Sarah McDougall must check the painting's condition.
So we're looking at the Bomberg today at Ghetto Theatre, condition reporting the work to make sure it's in exactly the same condition when it leaves the exhibition as when it came in. And I'm delighted to report that there are no changes and it still looks to be in excellent condition. So from our point of view, that's an ideal condition report.
The Ghetto Theatre is ready for its next journey. Not to return to its home at Ben-Uri, but to be placed in a customised crate to go to be forensically examined at London's world-renowned Courtauld Institute. If there is an image underneath, it can only be seen as an X-ray. It is a difficult task. The priceless painting cannot be damaged. In the quiet of the Institute's studio, Dr. Aviva Bernstock and her assistant Sylvia Rita Amato begin the painstaking task of extracting the painting from its frame. For the first time in nearly 100 years, the Ghetto Theatre is free.
Here would be the one where you see the change, but you wouldn't see it unless you do a whole X-ray. You won't really see what it might show if there is another composition under there. But if it's just a change in this current composition, so an artist just modifying the composition a bit, then it wouldn't be so dramatic.
It is a slow and laborious process. The tension mounts as everyone waits for the painting to be X-rayed.
So what we have to do is check that there's no radiation leakage. So this is a Geiger counter which measures the radiation. This is the ambient radiation. So if the counts go up, then we know there's a leakage. So we check it every time. So now we can press the compressor and fire it through. Good. White underneath, isn't there? So now, given that we have to overlap these to make sense, what's that? But do you see that there's a sort of, all this looks like something else, and then this could be sky. You see this line?
So this one is not there.
No. So I think there's a landscape under here, and that's a kind of mountain. But it's actually very puzzling. It's a completely different composition. And we get rid of all that and make it work together, and then it'll become clearer what the sky are. These are part of the top composition, so that's the banister of the balustrade of the theatre, and this is the bar that keeps people from falling down to the lower level, and that's in the top composition. And otherwise it's quite confusing to see what elements are in the top composition and what are in the underlying composition, because these very bold brushstrokes, which cross over the boundaries between the figures in the top and bottom, cross over everything. I think that could be due, I don't know, but sometimes you see this, and it looks like something's been cut off the stretcher and then another canvas has been put on top of it, and I think this might be a mountain and that's the foreground, so it could go either way. But whatever happens is we need to mosaic this together and flip it around to see whether we can see any recognisable composition, but there is something different underneath this picture. It's just we can't quite work out what it is. It wasn't wrong about the underlying composition after all.
Will Bomberg expert Richard Cork recognise the image beneath the Ghetto Theatre? Or will it be a totally different and previously undiscovered picture?
Well, the image of the Ghetto Theatre is structurally still quite strong within it, so you have to kind of almost work your way through that, don't you, towards what else is there. But I'm not actually finding it very easy.
Although we may never be able to fully see the composition underneath the Ghetto Theatre, there is one thing we know for certain, namely that all of David Bomberg's experiences provided the foundations that enabled him to create his magnificent works of art. Nothing can diminish the power and the intensity of a masterpiece. It is a thing of beauty that can last forever.